individuals or corporates may have acted as inspiration for our own.
It is always okay to not.
Let's talk about concussion.
That's a tale for another time.
Thank you.
I want to start talking about homelessness from a somewhat unusual position, and that is talking about the show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Do we have any fans in the audience? Yeah. So my husband loves this show. I don't care for it so much, but we found it really useful recently in thinking about homelessness. For those of y'all who have not seen the show, it features I think we could call them adults. They're trying to adult at least, living and sometimes working in the city of Philadelphia. They're dubbed the gang. The gang is always up to solving a problem and going out there and doing good in the world. Except they're really not. They are really terrible people. They're self-absorbed egomaniacs. They can't actually identify a problem to save their lives. And then the solutions they come up with are quite terrible and wouldn't solve the problem that they think they're trying to solve in the first place. Every episode ends with at least some set of them yelling at each other, fighting for their solution to a problem. Nothing gets solved, and the gang just goes on to the next problem that they're after. So one night I came home from a neighborhood association meeting about homelessness. And how many of y'all have been to a neighborhood association meeting or a community meeting where people have been talking about homelessness? Yeah, those aren't always the best meetings. At every meeting, it seems that someone is shouting about the problems of homelessness, drug addiction, mental illness, the need for housing. Wait, what about the theft that's happening? What about people having to use the outdoors for public hygiene purposes? And then people will start yelling about their solutions. And they're yelling about, well, we need more mental health. Let's reopen the mental health institutions and lock everyone up. Put everyone in jail and make them sober up. Those lazy ones just need a kick in the butt to get going. Someone's also always got an app who is gonna solve the problem of homelessness. Don't bring me any more apps, y'all. Please, no more apps. And so my husband, I was telling this story, he stopped me and said, "Wife, you were trapped in an episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia." And I paused and I realized that he was actually quite right. And it's not that I think that most of us who are talking about and upset about homelessness right now are bad people. In fact, I think many of us are really great people who are just confused about the problem and what the solution actually is. So what is the problem when we talk about homelessness? Well, it's in the word. It's a home. It's to be without a home. Therefore, the solution is housing. This sounds absurdly simplistic, and so I want to talk a little bit about why this is so hard to actually accomplish and why this is, in fact, the solution. Now, many of y'all have probably seen in your city increases in homelessness, right? So between 2017 and now, in Marion and Polk counties, you saw a 20% increase of people experiencing homelessness. Across the state of Oregon, youth homelessness, according to our school records, went up 2%. Up and down the West Coast, we are seeing increases. In fact, the federal government recently released numbers indicating that the driver of the increase in homelessness nationally was because of California and Oregon. So what is happening in our states? We don't suddenly have a lot more people who are poor. We just have a lot less housing that is affordable to people who don't have a lot of money. Many of y'all are probably starting to feel this pinch. More and more of us are renters. More and more of us face severe rent burden. It makes us impossible to be able to access housing. And why is that? We don't have a right to a house. Our ability to access housing is fundamentally tied to our wealth. And this means as the housing market spirals upwards, fewer people can stay in their homes. In Portland, we had entire apartment complexes receive eviction notices so that developers could rehab buildings and rent them at a higher rate. Entire apartment complexes with no place to go. This has happened up and down the coast, and it continues to happen. Warehouses where people were squatting, now built, redeveloped, turned into fancy condos with expensive shops in the middle, the first floor. Where do those folks go? Well, those are the people that you now see sleeping on your street. There's always been homelessness with us. We just haven't been very good about talking about it because we haven't been able to see it. People have lived in poverty across the country, And the reason the housing market is so critical to this discussion is that we know that in other states, people are still able to stay in their housing regardless of their life circumstances. It's important to keep in mind that that doesn't mean their housing is okay or acceptable, but that they aren't forced out to the streets so that a developer can make more money to allow someone with a lot of money to be able to purchase that home. So as we see more people on the streets, we are very driven to respond to them. For some of us, it's because it's very hard to see people suffering, and it is. It's also overwhelming because if you look at the faces of the people on the street and you ask any one of them what their story is, they might point to a whole list of things that have gone wrong. And so then we wonder, is the problem mental health? Is the problem drug addiction? Is the problem not being able to get a job? It's those things and many, many more. But we know that fundamentally, the way that we can help people is by providing them a stable place to live. If you, for instance, take what we often describe as the people who are the hardest to keep in housing, those are some of the people that you see on the streets today. We know that a housing program called Housing First demonstrates amazing success at keeping people in housing. That program invites you into a stable place to live and puts no restrictions on you and says, this is your stable housing. You don't have to leave. You don't have to do what we say. You just have to be. And by giving people that power, stabilizing them in that way, they are able to do the things that they need to do to stay in housing. Maybe it's get a job. Maybe it's take their medication regularly. There's a whole list of things that people can do better because they have a stable place to sleep. So we know that housing is the issue, but the other thing that happens is that we really miss the scale of the problem because we are so driven by the people we see on the street. And the people that we see on the street, the ones that we tend to notice are the people who are in the most serious trouble. And so when you look around, you think, wow, we've got a huge homeless problem because there's several thousand people on the street. Well, at Portland State University in this last August, we released a study that in 2017, 38,000 people experienced homelessness across the Tri-County region. 5,600 of them were unsheltered, or meaning that they were living on the street, in cars, in warehouses. You are seeing a tiny portion of that population when you focus on the people who are on the streets and let them drive conversations like whether there should be a camping ban or not. Now again, I understand why we end up focusing on that, but that's fundamentally a different question than answering the question of the problem of solving homelessness. What we're really doing when we go into neighborhood association meetings and fighting it out over what to do about people who are sleeping on our sidewalks is we're actually trying to answer the question, what is our responsibility, or what should our response be to the very real situation that people are suffering and they're impacting the systems of our cities that weren't equipped to deal with this. If you actually want to talk about solving homelessness, though, that is tied to housing. All right, so that sounds easy. Back to the idea that housing is simple, because it is. All right, so here's some fun ideas that we could have. Oprah could just show up and say, you get a house, and you get a house, and you get a house. We could all leave tonight, and say, you know what, let's enact the biggest revenue measure possible to pay for housing for everyone. Now everyone's like, not so sure about that. One of my other favorite ones is that in Portland, in 2017, we had thousands of vacant luxury housing units available, enough to house every unsheltered person in the region. The government has the power to, in fact, take property. It's called eminent domain. So why don't we use eminent domain to take those units and house people? Here's my favorite one. How many of y'all received government assistance growing up to stay in your house or have continued to receive it? All right, how many of you own a home through a mortgage? And you claim the mortgage interest tax deduction? Yeah. Congratulations, you are the recipient of the largest federal housing assistance program in the country. The mortgage interest tax deduction is a $71 billion assistance program to help people stay in their housing. 90% of those benefits go to people who make $100,000 a year or more. So let's repeal that. Ooh, that one is the scariest of them all. Okay, so why do these ideas sound outlandish and impossible? Why are we not likely to do them? And this is what I really want y'all to take away from this talk. Housing is a solution to homelessness, but the reason we don't want to solve the problem is because it requires us to look internally and understand that hundreds of years ago, our country created an entire housing system predicated on the idea that only certain people deserved a home. When you think about the early days in the United States, many of us have this image of everyone coming together and raising roofs together and putting hammers on the walls, and it was fantastic. Neighbors help neighbors. But that's not really what it was like. From the start, white men only with wealth could access housing. And no, this isn't the point in the talk where I'd start to say that all white men are terrible. I married a white man, so y'all are fine. But we have to remember that the foundations of our country set into motion what we have today. We structurally created homelessness for entire sets of people. Enslaved African Americans lived in sheds and shacks and stables. White women could not earn a salary or own property. Native Americans were pushed off their land titles stripped, and marched across the country, many living in the Pacific Northwest today, who started off in completely different places. And the mentally ill, they were sent to the countryside to live in sanitariums where they were often experimented in. We let people be homeless from the start of this country. And to be surprised at the idea there is still serious homelessness today means that we haven't really accepted how we started and created an unequal foundation in this country for so many people. 40% of the homeless population in this country is made up of African American people. African Americans are only 13% of the nation's population. Many of you will be shocked to hear that number, but none of us should be surprised. We said from the start, if you were not a wealthy white man, you did not have a right to a home. That these are the exact people we see today who are most vulnerable to housing is a given. And so now we have to ask questions about why and what do we do next? Well, one of the hardest things to do is to understand that many of us grew up in a space where the single-family home was the dream. Many of us grew up in single-family homes. We believed home ownership was the pinnacle of success, and most importantly, if we all worked really hard, we could achieve that. And most of us do work really, really hard. The problem is that if you start off at a lower base or in poverty, it's much harder to be able to get out of that. It takes 20 years of everything going right these days to be able to get out of poverty. If you are living in poverty, there is no way that you can, in fact, afford a home, particularly in today's housing market. So what can we do? Well, you can leave today and say, go Google housing as a universal right petition. What does that mean? Well, in 1996, the UN created housing as a universal right for everyone. You can look at social housing programs from around the world, Singapore, the Netherlands, powerful examples of how to provide housing in a way that does not tie housing to wealth or to desert, right? It's about having a right that each and every one of us deserve a house. After you sign that petition that says, yes, I'm all in, everyone should have a house to live in regardless of their life circumstances, because the only way that somebody can succeed is by having a stable place to live. Then I want you to email your elected officials and say, I'm in for more revenue to go to providing that housing. I'm going to dig deep and find a little bit more money to give, or I'm going to give up my pet program and say, put it on hold while we provide the housing. And then I want you to really think about, why do our ideas sound so impossible? It sounded impossible at one point in time that women would have the right to vote, or that African Americans and Mexican Americans could sit at a lunch counter with people who were white. And we accomplished those things. And so I believe that we can question things like the mortgage interest tax deduction. I believe that we can ask people with wealth, considerable wealth, to pay more into our system to provide housing. I believe that our housing market does not have to be simply based on wealth. Thank you.